Welcome to Energy Radio, a podcast by CEM Engineering. Welcome to this episode of Energy Radio. This is episode 20 in our podcast, and today I'm joined by David McMillan of City of Toronto. You are a program manager in the Environmental and Energy Division, is that right?
That's right.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I'm looking forward to our conversation. It's from a different perspective, I think, than we've had so far on the show, so I'm really keen to get your perspective on what you guys are doing, but also I think we've done a little bit of background on you, and we're meeting for the first time today, but I have this sense that you have a passion for what we're going to talk about. So I think passion, whether it's the video or it's the audio on a podcast, passion comes through. So maybe just give us a brief intro of how do you get here, your background in this space, what brings you from growing up to here, and a bit about your role, and then we'll kind of launch into the topics if that's okay.
Absolutely, yeah,
cool.
That sounds good. Yeah, I mean, for me, my undergrad was in applied sciences, and sort of around fourth year, I was studying genetic engineering of bacteria to produce hydrogen.
Okay.
Science, and they got me down this path of renewables and technology. And so after graduating, not wanting to work in the lab for a bit, working a couple of part-time jobs, I decided to go back and get my master's in urban planning.
Okay.
It seemed like a practical way to kind of put my passion for energy into practice. And I've always been really interested in sort of city building and urbanism.
Okay.
So went back, did my master's, and about partway through I did a study, an internship essentially in Germany at a university in Stuttgart, and they were doing community energy planning sort of years ahead of where we were in Ontario. And so I took that experience really and tried to bring it back here as best as I could, and found the right timing to work at the City of Toronto.
Okay.
And we've been doing that for the last 5 years essentially.
Good for you.
Yeah.
So undergrad in science, through that you realize you have a passion for energy. You take that, you add to it, you augment it with your kind of planning perspective. And then you add to it again with your European experience. Is that a fair kind of building of your resume? And it's interesting. I've done a lot of work with European technology providers, particularly biogas, and so we've our roots are back in Europe, and we've always held that notion that they're kind of ahead of us. But you saw that as well.
Absolutely, yeah. I was getting some firsthand experience working with a team of, so they're at a university, but they were doing some very practical work.
Okay.
And actually sort of designing mostly district energy systems for small cities sort of around Stuttgart, anchored by biomass plants right in the urban center. And I looked at that and I thought, why aren't we doing this locally in Ontario? And there was, there's obviously a number of reasons that I've come to understand.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's clearly not a technology problem.
Okay.
They've been doing this for a long time in Germany, and I thought we need to at least be thinking along this approach, local energy systems. And
well, let's unpack that for a minute. So give me an example of what's a comparable city in terms of size. So you said it was small cities around Stuttgart that are putting in district energy, DE, around biomass. Is this a Burlington sized city? Is it a Fergus or Aurora? What's the comparable?
Yeah, I would say
put you on the spot.
Burlington's probably a good example.
Okay.
They have, I forget the population numbers, but they have a downtown core, right? And most European cities, they don't have the higher, taller buildings, but it's quite dense.
Yes.
Surrounded by what you'd see here, right? But more dense versions of our suburbs.
Okay.
But even at those scales, they're making district energy work. So they have the density. But energy prices being what they are, they can sort of make those upfront investments with thermal networks.
Yes.
To supply low carbon heating to even single family homes.
Yeah.
The project we were actually working on was actually taking heat off of a primary loop that was higher temperature, and serving sort of lower density single family homes from that primary loop.
Cool.
And so we're not there yet here, but I mean, that's, I think, where we're going. Lower temperatures, right? Lower carbon.
Yes.
Yeah, and so again, we're kind of seeing the future a little bit, and how they integrate renewables at those lower temperatures.
So you said you did a bit of an assessment of why it was working there and why it hasn't taken off here. Is there one or two gaps, that we have, or we're behind here, or we don't have this, or what was your assessment of why we're not doing that here?
I mean, one thing is the way they plan their cities.
Okay.
It's kind of more amenable to those sort of networks because of the upfront capital costs. You want things to be dense and
Yes.
have that mix of uses. That really helps. Higher energy prices there really
Okay.
are a strong motivator to look at alternatives to fossil fuels, right?
Yeah.
But then, just in terms of governance as well, like there's some things that don't translate well. We just have a very different approach to, I think, thinking about local energy solutions.
Right.
But I think we're headed in that direction.
Okay. Yeah.
And I learned a lot that is translatable, but like anything, it's there has to be a lot of interpretation to sort of transfer that policy or that approach. We're very much here more about business to business type relationships, right? Over there's a lot of senior level of government support to do these things, whether the utilities are owned by government or not. There's a lot of investment from government in these types of systems. Whereas here, it's really about the opportunity for businesses, I think, to capitalize on that trend, and we're starting to see that, which is great. But government sometimes plays a role in accelerating things.
Yes.
And we've been kind of up and down with that in Ontario.
Yeah.
But I think ultimately we're seeing in Toronto at least businesses starting to move in that sort of low carbon energy developer business model, we call it. They're going there anyways.
Okay.
So it's positive for sure.
Mm-hmm. So you said about 5 years or so now with the City of Toronto, is that
Yeah.
right? Yeah. So talk to me about your role, what you're focused on, kind of what your mandate is in your role.
So my main job has been to build a relationship with city planning. So city planning, there's a division that deals with all aspects of new development in Toronto.
Okay.
And so my role has been to connect energy at every level with the city planning division. So from broad official plans that cover the whole city to sort of neighborhood plans. So that's when we do community energy type plans.
Yes.
Right down to individual buildings.
Okay.
We do all the compliance review for our Toronto Green Standard on behalf of city planning. So it's been about basically energy. We don't own any assets. We're not responsible for sort of a process within the city. So it's about what could we attach ourselves to kind of give us something tangible. And city planning, nothing gets approved without going through them.
Right.
So it's about adding in those energy pieces and getting the industry to kind of think about that as they're doing their typical sort of development, right?
Right. So your mandate is really to be a facilitator for responsible energy development.
Yeah.
I maybe don't have the phrasing perfectly, and then your specific approach is seeing the planning department as a key gate in terms of development, and so you're really focused on kind of latching onto them and making sure that energy is in the back of their mind with everything, or maybe not even the back, front of their mind in terms of everything that happens, right?
Yeah. So that was one main thing. The others, we do a lot of our own projects as well.
Oh yes.
So we've done a couple of district energy projects, combined heat and power. So we lead by example as the city, and we learn from that to kind of craft the right policy framework for the industry to respond to, right?
Okay.
So we want to be policymakers based on practice. So we learn from the projects that we do, so we get it right when we kind of push the industry to do that.
Okay.
And that's a big part of the city's role, is sort of leading by example.
Yeah.
Doing things that maybe the private sector isn't quite ready to do on their own.
Yeah.
Learning what works, what doesn't, and then trying to scale that up as best as possible. Yeah.
Are you, in terms of private developers, I would imagine there is a sector that are, I don't want to call them conventional, but real estate developers who are, building multi-res or whatever. I don't know that space very well. But then is there also a development industry that you're seeing and engaging with that's focused on the energy side? Like, I'm thinking of it as an example. We had Diego Mandelbaum in here from Creative Energy. They're a group that I think they would call themselves a developer, but not worried about building condos and multi-res and things like that. But on the energy side, are you seeing both? Are you? I would imagine you're interfacing with both. Or talk to me a bit about the development community.
Yeah. So I guess what we've realized over the last few years is that there was limited appetite from real estate developers to take on the energy piece of. So to add that to their business, they wanted to focus on developing, multi-res buildings or commercial offices or, what have you, right? also there wasn't the utilities weren't trying to take this on in an unregulated sort of space.
Okay.
So that created room for the energy developer, the creative energies, as you mentioned, the N-Waves, the Diversos, Noventa, Subterra. These are the ones that are top of mind in Toronto right now, who are doing projects. And so what they essentially offer is to a real estate developer is, we'll help you meet the Toronto Green Standard, and we'll take the upfront sort of capital costs of the infrastructure, right? And you'll pay us back, or your condo board, whoever you pass it on to, will pay us back over time through an energy services agreement, which is very standard in the industry. It's just that we're not necessarily for multi-res buildings and things like that. So that's the energy developer business model, which kind of it helps in the absence of a true business case for renewables today. By extending it over 20 or 30 years, you can kind of make the business work. And developers have to meet the Toronto Green Standard. So it's kind of a bit of a win-win. There's a premium cost, but I mean, it's cheaper for them to go with an energy developer probably than to try and learn how to do this themselves, for the most part.
And that piece about learning how to do it themselves, and we talk about it in industrials about core competencies, right? We work for a lot of food and beverage, and for them making their product, whether it be a soft drink or tissue or some kind of commodity or some kind of consumable, I meant, sorry. That's their core business, right? Energy's not. And I would imagine you're seeing the same thing with people who are developing or building or operating high-rise buildings versus they say that's not my core business, right? That's a penthouse on the roof that I have to deal with, that kind of thing. You're seeing some of that?
Definitely, for sure, in the residential space, and more specifically condominiums, because that the ownership model there is you build and you sell, you don't hold that asset, and so you're the developer, you exit. So there's no real incentive to invest up front. Some are better than others. Don't get me wrong; they do it as part of their brand. But I mean, fundamentally, it's something that's left to non-professionals to do. So our advice or whenever we have the opportunity, we like to say that. Focus on real estate development, absolutely. But think about sort of the, what legacy you want to leave, and what that could look like if you were to partner with an energy developer who can stay around and make sure that asset operates well, specific to energy. Because for purpose-built rental, for commercial office, and especially for institutions like universities and hospitals, that they'll have sort of on-site energy management and professionals dedicated to that. And they're motivated from a bottom line perspective anyways. But it's primarily residential and more specifically condos that we're pushing hard to think about that business model.
Cool. And that developer, like the creatives of the world, that energy services provider, you talk about extending the time horizon. Is it because they have a different capital model, or is it more a picture of kind of vision of the future? What do you think is allowing them confidence to extend their model, which allows them to justify the front end capital of district energy?
I think probably the one thing that stands out is most of these energy developers, if not all of them so far, are all backed by large either pension funds or private equity firms who they're big enough that I think they're willing to sort of get returns on less annual returns or look out at a longer period of time, thinking about sort of just a stable operating asset. So they're not expecting 15% returns like a condo developer would be, right? Sell and get out. They're in it for the long term. So I think that helps a lot. Because there would not be quick returns with setting up a new district energy system or even there's still a cost premium for renewables. We're not at the point yet where that's the default, right? So I think that really helps. The way they're set up and who funds them essentially makes a lot of sense. I haven't dug into that business model particularly, but that to me is the big difference between them and perhaps others is that they've set up their business in a way to kind of look out 20 or 30 years. And it kind of lines up with the assets with the infrastructure they're putting in the ground. So I think it kind of works well in that sense for them.
I think you're 100% right. And the other piece to that is they also have sitting with creative, and we've been with others, they have a vision for, and maybe they have that luxury because of their funding model, but they have a vision that looks out 20, 30 years, and they see a world that has learned to deal with climate change and things like that, and they're making decisions based on that world and not today's price of oil, for example, right?
Yeah.
So
That's
let's pivot a bit to kind of a higher level. Talk to me a bit about city council. I think last year, kind of big proclamation around climate change, things of that nature. I don't want to give any more descriptors because I'm going to get it wrong. But I want to set the table for you to walk us through what Toronto City Council has done, and then kind of want to talk, or what they've kind of said, and then what's happening as a result.
Yeah, so back a few years ago in 2015, basically after Mayor Tory came back from Paris, right?
Okay,
which is one of, not the most recent, but one of the more recent COPs, right?
Yes.
He, it was sort of his big kind of moment in terms of climate after being elected, to kind of set the stage for what Toronto, I think, was going to do. And there was a group of councillors, of course, who was also very motivated to take that on. And they started the process of what will become Transform TO, or Climate Action Plan.
Okay.
And so that...
Just to make sure everybody... So Transform TO, that's the brand of your Climate Action Plan.
That's right.
Okay.
So we've had one since about 2007, and
Okay.
it's gone through a couple of iterations, but the most recent is the name is Transform TO. And throughout basically 2017, 2018 is when it was finalized. The direction was get to 80% less GHGs by 2050 compared to a 1990 baseline,
Okay.
which was sort of the standard in
Yes.
terms of where most municipalities or institutions were kind of headed.
Okay.
So that was the main thrust of that is reducing emissions in Toronto.
Okay.
And there was a whole bunch of specific goals and sort of actions to come out of that.
Okay.
But what happened in 2019, again after sort of another, just after coming back from Copenhagen and from London, Mayor Tory again and council members decided 80% by 2050 is not good enough. We need to be more aggressive, and so they declared a climate emergency and basically said we need to get to zero emissions earlier than 2050. So technically it's net zero by 2040 or by 2050 with a sort of a stretch goal of 2040.
Okay.
So that's the most recent target, and later this year we'll have the new modeling done to basically show what that's going to look like.
Wow.
In terms of what needs to be done to get there. And I think the actions are not so different from what they were, just we need to go further and faster.
Yeah. So talk to me about net zero. I think that's one of those terms that can mean a lot of different things to different people.
Yeah.
In your view, what does net zero mean? Like, how does the math work? What does it explicitly mean for you guys?
As a practitioner, for me, it's in a technical sense, we need to push as far as we can to get to zero. But then, there's going to be some things that are probably out of our control.
Yes.
So that net is really what else do we need to do to offset whatever emissions are left by, let's say, 2040. And there's different ways to sort of offset that. The preference, at least from our perspective, is doing things within the city of Toronto.
Right.
Within the city, generating electricity, right, things like that.
Okay.
Our messaging though really is we're trying to get to zero emissions, because that net piece kind of can be difficult to explain.
Yes,
and sometimes there's a lot of nuance in it.
Sure. Yeah.
But so what we tell the public, and it's true, we're trying to push for zero emissions. So new development, trying to make it zero carbon. When you do retrofits, we're trying to,
So just to be explicit for people who might be listening, net zero, zero carbon, whatever, you've set aside the old approach, which was a percentage relative to a previous number. This is just this piece of property, this city, this province or country. When you say zero, it's zero, right? Just
absolutely.
To be 100% clear.
That's right. That's the message we're taking out. We need to get to zero emissions.
Okay.
And
So your Transform TO, has that been updated as a result of last year's announcement, or you're not there yet?
That's what's underway right now.
Underway now. Okay.
So in May we'll have our first council report, basically on sort of progress since. It'll be the second progress update since Transform TO was approved. And it's only been a couple of years, but it'll show that we're sort of moving in the right direction.
Yes.
And then later this year, Q4 basically, is when we'll have our updated report on Transform TO in a net zero scenario now.
Okay.
Yeah, so there'll be some additional modeling work to be done.
Yeah.
Basically updating the modeling that was done a couple of years ago. And again, I think it's largely going to show a lot of the same things in terms of the actions we set shouldn't be very different. It's going to be, we need to do more of it.
Right.
And what other things will we need support on from other levels of government to get there?
Yeah.
I think that's my sense of where things are going. Yeah.
Wow. Mm-hmm. So when you look at that zero emissions, is that, like, how big is the circle, right? Is it City of Toronto buildings? Is it City of Toronto operations, which would include transportation? Mm-hmm. Is it the City of Toronto? Like, how big is the circle in the mandate that you have? Yeah,
for the most part right now it's scope 1 and 2 emissions.
Okay.
There is some, of course, cross-boundary.
And just for education, scope 1 is, just walk me through scope 1 and scope 2.
Yeah, so scope 1 are the things that you sort of directly generate emissions from.
Right. Burning gas in a boiler, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, scope 2 is sort of purchased utilities, right?
Yes.
And then scope 3 are the things that there's not a perfect boundary for them, right? And so things like cross-border transportation, things like that.
Okay.
So we're a little bit into that in Toronto. Like,
sure.
I think we account for sort of GO train transportation and things like that.
Okay.
But it's not perfect, and transportation in particular is a tough one.
Yes.
So we're moving in that direction though, as part of our inventories to account for more and more of that each year.
Okay. Wow.
And then hopefully as part of that we get into, and I think this is the plan, into consumption-based emissions generally. So not just travel, but also sort of anything that we consume, generates emissions elsewhere, but it's because of our consumption, right?
Right.
And so, from the building side, embodied carbon is the new probably big thing that's coming, but just anything we consume really. So we're moving our inventory in that direction to properly account for all GHGs.
Yeah. But it's all GHGs in your case. Like, where does a large industrial plant fit if they're within the City of Toronto's boundaries? Where does that fit vis-a-vis your targets? Is that kind of excluded because, I mean, they have to deal with that on their own, or like, how does that work?
No, they would be included.
Really?
For whatever emissions they generate, on site, and then what of course has to be accounted for in terms of the utilities they get.
Okay.
Some electricity, right, coming from out of the city.
Yes.
Yeah. So that definitely gets included.
Okay.
In the emissions, and those, there's been a lot of obviously deindustrialization over the years. In Toronto, I think industry accounts for about 1 million tons, relatively small compared to the vast majority of activity, which is our homes where we work, and getting back and forth between them is really what generates the vast majority of emissions in Toronto. So industry,
it's important, but it's not necessarily the biggest piece is elsewhere.
Right. That's right.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So another landmark or another big piece, I think, is the Toronto Green Standard, right? Mm-hmm. Can you talk to us about that and how that permeates what you're doing or what the development community might be doing, or what does that really mean, the Toronto Green Standard?
So the Green Standard has been around since about 2008. It started sort of voluntarily. It was primarily crafted to deal with stormwater. We were dealing with basement flooding and serious stormwater management issues in Toronto.
Yes.
And so that's where it started. But then it kind of evolved into sort of energy, air quality, and that it's been sort of ramped up over the years in terms of the minimum requirements.
Yes.
The most recent iteration is version 3.
Okay.
That came into effect in May 2018, and that was a big big step from the previous version, where we now have 4 tiers.
Yes.
Tier 1 being the minimum, and then 2 to 4 being sort of higher tiers that step up. They're voluntary, but I mean there are some incentives to kind of get there. But the bottom line is that the Toronto Green Standard is driving a lot of the activity we're seeing in Toronto.
Yes.
Because the requirements are hard as they are and going to get harder. Any developer who's looking out several years is going to have to be thinking, at that time, it's going to be, I have to hit this target.
Yes.
So it's in their mind now, and that's starting to change sort of how they run their business.
Awesome. So is there in the 2018 release, there are elements of it that are mandatory, right?
Yes.
And is the sense that the bar will, as the calendar moves and as new developments come in, that bar for what is mandatory will continue to ratchet up? Is that a fair assessment? Yeah,
so the goal is basically by 2030, all new buildings will be net zero emissions.
Okay, is that like tier 4?
That's tier 4, exactly.
Okay.
So in the interim, every 4 years, we'll go to that next level, right? So in 2022, the current tier 2, which is voluntary, one step up above the minimum, that tier 2 will become the minimum.
Wow.
So that bar gets raised every time. So by 2030, tier 4 is the minimum. So you'll only be able to get approved for a net zero building,
Excellent.
net zero emissions building starting then. And that's just for the industry at large. The city set itself to be sort of one iteration earlier. So by 2026, we have to be designing
for your own buildings.
For our own buildings.
Yes.
And that may even be accelerated. Just late last year, a city councillor basically said we need to study sort of the cost implications for net zero now.
Wow.
So the reality is like we're accelerating, at least for ourselves, and the industry is already showing some early leadership. So I think we're going to be ahead of 2030. We're going to start seeing a lot of net zero new construction.
And what's the feedback been from the development community? Is it like, hey, you guys are nuts, this is going to shut down development in Toronto? Or is it, hey, this is a piece of cake, no problem? Or is it somewhere in between?
It's definitely in between.
Okay.
There's always sort of a leading cohort of developers who embraces the challenge, right?
Yes.
And then there's those, sort of anything energy sustainability related is kind of, just one other thing they need to do. And construction in Toronto and the GTA in general is expensive. And so anytime you're sort of adding to those costs, it's a difficult conversation. But I mean, I think they get the rationale behind it and they're used to having a green standard.
Okay.
So the conversation is really about how can we help? How can the city help you in terms of incentives? We have some tools at our disposal to help.
Yeah.
And because there are some very difficult challenges. So that's really about how do we get there, which is a great conversation to have.
Yeah. So how does it apply, like most of our work and there's, well, not even so much about our work, but we're talking a lot about new build, but how does this apply to, does this get applied to anybody who's applying for a building permit? Does this, is it triggered by a site plan? Like, how does this get applied to some of the more incremental growth in the city?
So it is triggered by site plan.
Okay.
So whenever you submit site plan, that's when you would be held to a certain TGS level.
Yes.
It doesn't apply to all building types. Okay. Industrial are exempt. I mean, we kind of sort of follow the building code in terms of the OBC, in terms of what's exempt and what's not.
I see.
And then there's size thresholds that anything below 2,000 square meters doesn't have to do the full energy model.
Okay.
So there's some nuance, but most of what we're building in Toronto, last year, 2019, we got 178 applications that came through our office.
Wow. So 178?
Yeah. And
excellent.
So we see everything that city planning sees.
Okay.
And, basically we're about 200 or so per year. And so that gives you a sense of, and that's just ones that are subject to TGS. So,
okay.
So
wow.
there's a lot of activity, obviously. And so that means, a lot of review to do.
Yeah.
So there's a small portion that are exempt, but the vast majority, there's some strict energy requirements that they have to meet.
Cool.
Yeah.
And to achieve those requirements, can you give me some examples of, like, what are the kind of current sexy technologies or what's coming down what are some of the, it's one thing to have the standard and figure out how to meet it, but let's get a bit more practical for a minute. What are some of the things they're doing to get there? So
the TGS right now has three specific, since January 1st, 2020, everybody now has to meet these three absolute targets, which are, there's a total energy use intensity, there's a GHG intensity, and then there's a thermal energy demand intensity, the TEDI. So on the TEDI is really about your envelope. Okay. It's independent of the heating source. It's really about how good of an envelope do you have.
Right.
So on that end, the innovation we're starting to see is lower window to wall ratios, triple glazed windows, continuous insulation, full accounting for thermal bridging, right? So there's an architectural element to start. Is how you design that building matters a lot in terms of will you get to that sort of TEDI requirement. And that's probably the hardest one. Because for two reasons. One, the supply chain for things like triple glazed windows, the trades for like continuous insulation, those things are not fully developed here. And also architects typically haven't been involved in energy modeling for most buildings in Toronto. So having to bring them in earlier to work with the energy modeler is a big shift in terms of how the developer runs their process, right?
Okay.
So that's a real challenge for us, and we're doing a lot of sort of outreach to the architecture industry to kind of say you need to start getting involved early, right?
And so what you're saying is they're used to coming up with this beautiful building, getting it to a certain concept, getting permitting, and then kind of worrying about the energy modeling when you got to size the boiler. Kind of thing. And you're saying no. you got to bring that team to the table here, because you're not going to get past first base with us unless you can prove that you're not letting all this heat out into the atmosphere, basically.
That's exactly it. It's, there's always been talk about integrated design, but we're truly having to go there.
Yeah, wow, okay.
It'll make the process easier the earlier you engage.
Yeah.
It's just, that adds some soft costs, right? There are fees to deal with, but I think in the end, you'll be better off by engaging early.
Yeah.
So that's probably the hardest one today.
Okay. And so this is a simple example. Does that mean we're going to see, you drive in Toronto and many urban centers and you see these gorgeous, all glass skyscrapers. We're going to see a change in what those look like? Is that?
Yeah, definitely on the residential side.
Okay.
On commercial office, there are some, so you'll start to see maybe triple glazed curtain walls. We're seeing some of that. That may not get you all the way to a tier 4 level Teddy.
Right.
But for now, we're seeing some of that. But definitely we're going to start to see more proper walls, like with punch windows as opposed to, a window wall construction.
Yeah.
And spandrel, like those, we'll start to see actual walls with smaller windows, so true assemblies, you know what I mean, rather than just sort of component pieces.
Yeah.
So that affects the architecture and also the trades. Like, I mean,
right.
We don't build a lot of walls now, right? It's all sort of precast stuff, but anyways, that's one thing that we're starting to see some innovation in from some smaller projects.
Yeah.
But that's where everything is going to have to go.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
Wow. So that's Teddy.
Yeah.
There's 2 other components as well.
Yeah. So EUI, most people are familiar with that. It's sort of a metric that's been around for a long time.
Yes.
And you can't build anything now that doesn't have efficient equipment.
Right.
You can't even spec inefficient equipment.
Right.
So EUI, I think, is pretty easy for most to meet. There are some for residential and commercial, right?
Yeah.
There are some archetypes that have their challenges, right?
Yes.
But we have flexibility where if we're dealing with a lab, like a wet lab, we're not going to hold them to obviously an EUI that is similar to something like a residential building, right?
Right.
But that one's pretty straightforward. I think GHGI as well. That's a new target for TGS. We haven't had anything like that before. Okay. But there's a lot of zero carbon technologies that are available, right?
Yeah.
Basically, it means a heat pump coupled to to some kind of low carbon source, whether it's the air, the earth, sewer heat.
Yeah.
But that's sort of in terms of the trajectory of what we're seeing. Yeah. We're basically electrifying buildings.
Right. Okay.
And coupling it with a low carbon heat source.
And when you're electrifying, it's more a heat pump as opposed to an electric boiler or something like that. Is that?
Electric boilers are an option for sure.
Yes.
And that may be how some have to deal with the peak.
Yeah. Okay.
But we're not at the point yet where that's sort of, you have to do that.
Okay.
For now, tier 1 and to a certain extent tier 2, you can probably get away with really efficient conventional equipment, provided you have a good envelope.
Yeah.
But eventually we'll be going to a point where it's all sort of heat pumps and supply, or district energy systems could be supplying a lot of your heating and cooling. So I think that's the direction for sure for tier 3 and tier 4.
Now, what do you make of, and maybe this wasn't in our prep notes, but when you talk to, so previous podcasts, we've had folks from Enbridge Gas, and so the big stat they love, and I quite like it too, is you have an electricity infrastructure of 25,000 megawatts in Ontario, and you have a gas infrastructure of about 85,000. And so when they hear electrification, things like that, they totally acknowledge that that's, we need to get to that GHG, intensity piece, but they say, well, how are we going to move from 85,000 megawatts, how are we going to move that onto the 25,000 if it's all done on a wires component? Like, how do you guys look at, heat pumps, electric boilers? Now you have another infrastructure challenge, right, in terms of, the company you own, Toronto Hydro, how they're going to handle that. Like, where do you guys? This is totally out of left field, not on the notes, but where are you guys at with that? Yeah,
no, those are some serious issues that we're grappling with. Electric vehicles as well.
Bingo.
Everything is sort of electrifying in terms of the plan, right?
Yes.
We're fortunate to have a low carbon grid.
Yes.
And so but the infrastructure, there's going to need to be a lot of upgrades done to the infrastructure, both on the distribution and perhaps the transmission level as well.
Yeah.
I think there are some ways to kind of mitigate some of that in terms of managing things smartly. Like, Toronto Hydro, I think would love to charge electric vehicles overnight.
Right.
Help fill in some of those gaps. Heat pumps, because we're heating dominant, would be more of a winter issue, right? So where we have some more spare capacity, right? But yeah, ultimately, so we need to do a lot of conservation.
Yeah,
we
right.
definitely do. That
Great
we need
point.
to do that anyways because the grid, when Pickering shuts down in 2025, probably be replaced with gas plants unless we can sort of conserve our way out of some of that. We'll need to do more distributed generation for sure.
Yeah.
Like within the city, especially where there's distribution constraints. Storage prices are dropping pretty rapidly, right? That can help.
Yes.
So it's going to take all of those things if we want to avoid, the doubling of our because electricity is already expensive, and so I don't think there'll be an appetite to sort of double the infrastructure.
Yeah.
We'll have to look at ways to avoid. And sort of all of those things I think combined to a certain extent.
Yeah, and I think another piece that fits there too is we need to green the gas grid too, right?
Right.
And whether that's a power to gas with a hydrogen play or it's renewable natural gas, it's albeit it's one technology or one approach, but we have to look at it holistically and say, my friend Richard Laszlo would say, this is where we're moving. It's up to, folks like us to figure out how we're going to get there, right? And that's what this discussion really is. It's not a matter of, are we going there? Your green standard is out there. The transform TO is out there. That's where we're going.
Yeah.
But these technical questions have to get answered, but we've answered them as a society in other ways, in other parts of society as well. That's what society does. We solve problems as technical people and engineers. But I do think in this case we have to have a really broad portfolio approach to how do we answer these kind of questions.
I totally agree, and we're doing an RNG project, a couple of them now in the city through our not at landfills but at our organic collection facilities.
Right. Yes. And
injecting essentially renewable natural gas into the Enbridge pipeline.
Yeah.
And so there's some capacity for that. I think with RNG, my sense, and from what I hear from Enbridge, is how much can we reasonably do, not only because of how many sources are available within sort of an area, but also like the infrastructure needs some changes as well, I think, to accommodate that. So that definitely is going to happen in my mind.
Yeah.
So again, like Transform TO, probably the ultimate thing that came out of it was the typical waterfall sort of diagram, or that wedge of all the slices of things that have to go in to get to that, at the time 80% and now net zero.
Yes.
It's going to be every single thing.
Right.
There's no reason to discount anything at this point.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's and I think we in this province we've always had an electricity first mindset, just because we've been so hydroelectric dominant. Sir Adam Beck and things of that nature. And so sometimes I think we get into that friction of electricity versus gas or electricity versus thermal, but there's too much of a crisis. We just got to set that aside and say, everybody's going to have a chance to compete here. Let's make sure we're looking at the right metrics to evaluate it. Let's compare apples to apples, but everybody's going to have a chance here because it's a big problem and we got to solve it, right?
And we're growing. Like it's the GTA and Toronto last year added 80,000 people. GTA was well over 100,000.
Yeah.
I mean, like the pie is expanding.
Yeah.
So let's not hold ourselves back. Let's innovate, right? But I think there's room for everybody to kind of play.
Bingo.
As long as we all ascribe to the same ultimate goal, then that's what matters, right?
Right.
But again, no reason to discount anything at this point.
So back to these tiers for a minute. Are we at the point where we have like tier 3 or tier 4 buildings, being developed or built or in operation, or how far are we progressing towards that?
Yeah, so because version 3 only came into effect in 2018,
right.
Nothing built under that standard yet, under that version.
Okay.
It's just too new, right?
Right,
and
sure.
Anything that would have submitted site plan, even in early 2018, it's probably still a couple of years away from being built.
Yeah.
Just the nature of development in Toronto.
Understood.
But there are definitely buildings that are performing at those levels.
Oh yeah?
Yeah,
okay.
like, we, up at York University, the new McEwen Center, which is an extension of the Schulich School of Business.
Yes.
That building is performing at tier 3 levels in terms of TEDI and EUI, and I think it's at close, if not there, for carbon at tier 4.
Really?
So again,
and that's based on actual operating data?
Yeah,
Wow.
that's what we've seen on some initial data.
Okay.
The reality is, like, there's probably many other buildings. It's just that because they weren't, we didn't model those buildings under version 3.
Right.
We don't know for certain.
Yes.
But I mean, there are buildings out there that, probably at some leading institutions who are already at that level because they're motivated to do it.
Yeah.
We are starting to see applications for tier 4 buildings. The one that comes to mind is the George Brown College's Arbor building, which is on Queens Quay.
Okay.
It's going to be a mass timber building. It's going to have it's going to be a research institute for mass timber, but then on the energy side, it's going to be, it's going to use deep lake water cooling. It's going to have solar PV. A lot of the heating loads will be met by heat recovery.
Yeah.
So it's doing all the things that we believe it's going to get to Tier 4.
Yeah.
And we're starting to see more that we haven't formally sort of reviewed them yet, so we know they're Tier 4, but they're on that path. So,
cool.
And again, it's mostly the institutions.
The
universities and colleges are really leading in this space.
Yeah. I was two things on that last piece. I was at the International District Energy Association, IDEA. They had their campus. They have 2 conferences a year, and the campus one is primarily schools and some hospitals, but primarily schools. And what struck me was these directors of utilities and people of that, or VPs of energy, that kind of place on the org chart are most of the people who are speaking and giving presentations, and the pressure that they get with the new crop of students every year saying, what are you doing with my campus and my tuition dollars? And my parents' donations, what are you doing to move the needle, right? And these students come in fresh. They don't have a concept of what has been done over the last 20 years to make York University the campus it is today, for example. All they care about is, what are you going to do tomorrow? And if you're not going to do something tomorrow, I'm 18, full of piss and vinegar, and I'm going to take some activist approach here and get something done. I'm baffled by, I'm not baffled, I get it. What I guess I was ignorant to the challenges that they have, and the reality that they have. It's quite something.
Yeah, no, the universities and colleges. I've been sort of working with all of them very closely lately because different contexts, but we want them to succeed because the buildings will be different. But if they can succeed in getting to Tier 4 net zero buildings, that will, I think, help the industry at large kind of move along in that direction.
Totally, yeah.
And they're all doing. They all have sort of low carbon action plans. They all have projects that are underway or planned to get to net zero. They're doing steam to hot water conversions of their thermal networks. They're integrating renewables. They're all doing it.
Yes.
And so it's really exciting, and that's something that I think we're interested to showcase as well.
Cool.
And we want them to succeed, not only because we're at the city and we want them to meet the TGS and Transform 2 objectives, but also because I only graduated from York a few years ago, and it's like I see a huge opportunity to educate the next class of, to educate the next workforce, to be in energy and in high tech space, to attract talent, right? To kind of have that, to innovate, right? And build on the success we already have with post-secondary here for the next generation. As well, and the beauty about an educational institution is you can learn right on your campus with a real project.
Yeah.
The living lab, experiential education component.
Yeah.
I think there's a huge opportunity there. Like I'm really, that to me is a win-win if you're a university today. So I think they're going in that direction for sure. And part of my role lately, anyways, is to help them do that.
Yeah. I'm glad you're seeing that, because I graduated from Mac, and it was about 5 years after I graduated was the first time I was in the steam plant at the campus. And as a mechanical engineer, I lamented, now I could have taken ownership of my own learning and figured out how to get my butt in there too, but here you have this beautiful steam plant, and it took me 5 years post-graduation to actually go there for the first time, right? So I think that experiential learning thing, and at Mac is the same way. It is changing. It is getting better. Yeah.
Totally.
You mentioned previously about George Brown's new building, and you used the term mass timber. I think I know what you mean, but explain that to me.
Yeah, so
it's like log cabin kind of stuff.
Well, yeah, I guess it's like the modern version of that essentially.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
Wood is generally speaking lower carbon than concrete and steel. Now there's all kinds of innovation happening with concrete and steel to kind of bring down those carbon footprints. But I mean, wood is also something that sequesters carbon, right?
Yeah.
So we're seeing. Again, all the colleges and universities pretty much have a mass timber building planned. Okay. In fact, they're pushing OBC to have relaxation of the 6-story limit. Okay. I think they're pushing to about 12 stories.
Wow.
Yeah, and so that's going to happen. That's another thing that we know is going to happen. The thing is, we hope it can also spur a lot of activity in Ontario. Right now, it's all coming from BC and Quebec. All the product.
The actual material, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but that's, of course, because the product is there, that's where the expertise is as well.
Right.
But Ontario's forestry sector, it's declined a lot recently, but there's no reason we couldn't help revive that, and have wood shipped from, within a few hundred kilometers to Toronto to build, and there's a lot of local economic benefits to having that back. So that's part of the benefit of moving towards mass timber as well, is it can help the region as a whole.
Yeah. Wow. That's hilarious. What's old is new again, right? Like,
actually, yeah.
That, even I was thinking earlier when you were talking about the windows and moving towards more conventional walls. I'm thinking back to you go to New York City or any big city and you have concrete and very small windows, right? We're going to see it's probably going to look a little different, but we're going to see a bit of a return to that style of architecture as well, I would imagine.
I think so. When you look at any passive house, I mean, it's very easy to tell the difference from the architecture, right? The thing is, like, I think the pendulum always swings back the other way. We went this whole route where everything has to be all glass, but then people put a couch in front of the window and they have curtains, and it's like, you don't need all that light and solar gain, like, you know what I mean? So I think we'll find that happy medium. I think there's a lot of benefit to having a really good envelope aside from energy in terms of quietness and air quality and things like that. So
cool.
I think that's definitely a trend as well.
You mentioned some of the stakeholdering you're doing with universities and colleges. What about different levels of government? What does it look like for the City of Toronto to work with the province or the feds in this particular energy space?
As you can imagine right now, to be fair, we don't have much of a relationship right now with the province.
Right.
Post 2018, cap and trade was canceled.
Right.
We always have a relationship. Don't get me wrong.
Understood.
But things were maybe happening. They were more accelerated under the previous government.
Yeah.
And so for now we're kind of just rolling with it.
Okay.
Conservation programs were canceled. We had to deal with the fallout of that, and we're just kind of seeing how things progress. Ultimately, that will change, like with anything. But for now, that's not really going anywhere. With the federal government, we're kind of waiting for them to make their move in terms of new programs to come out.
Okay.
I guess post-budget we'll know a bit more.
Yeah.
But we expect some serious investment, based on what they've said in terms of green infrastructure. Like whether it's directly to municipalities or through the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, or the Canada Infrastructure Bank. There's all kinds of, but so far the rollout's been a little bit slower than maybe we would have hoped. But so with the province, I think with the feds it's about the money. I think with the province, really maybe what we'll work with them on in any case is like authorities. We as a municipality, like even as a big one, we have the same authorities as pretty much any other one in Ontario.
And that's in some ways pretty limited.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah. And I'm not there's different reasons why we would want more of it, but in energy specifically, the building code and the TGS, there's always a tension there, right?
Right.
There's all kinds of things that make it
one thing that we see is air permitting. So if you want to move to biomass or things like that, there's a bit of a void in terms of permitting that matches today's technology, right? So that's a great way to shape it. You get the feds with the money bags, Trudeau, and the feds, and then you have the province. But you need two different things from two different groups, right?
That's exactly.
And at the same time, I'm getting the sense that you guys aren't waiting, right? You're moving ahead. You'd love to have their support, but you guys are going to figure out ways to move ahead regardless. Right?
We have to, and we're really fortunate in the city to have the staff complement that we do. Our division is at least 80 right now.
Whoa!
Which that's huge for an environment and energy group.
I had no idea.
Yeah. And so we're very fortunate to have that because it means we have the capacity to do a lot, irrespective of what the other levels of government are doing. There are some fundamental things that we can't do without their support, but there's a lot we can do to move forward and to support the industry moving forward.
Cool.
So we're really, really fortunate, and Transform TO played a big role. 5 years ago we were maybe half of, in the last couple of years, we've really added people because council's made the decision to fund this as a priority.
Yeah, they're putting their money where their mouth is.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's awesome. Cool.
Yeah, so it's a great time to be in that space.
Yeah. Wow, this has been great. It's a space of the energy world that because it's municipal and it's largely less industrial, more development. It's something that I personally haven't had a lot of exposure to, but it's interesting when you get into stuff like mass timber and the wall, the technical stuff we've talked about, but also the macro stuff in terms of, that shows how, focused on industrials I am, is I had no idea. I guess I stood back and I could see it, but how small of a piece that is in terms of your whole picture at the city. So this has been great. Now you're clearly passionate about this. Are there other things we haven't talked about that you're like, I'd love to talk about this, or maybe your own personal energy journey, or we got a couple minutes left. Anything else we've missed in this great conversation?
Yeah, like in the prep notes, I was excited that there was a question about cycling, because like I'm a big cyclist.
Yes.
I'm big on transit too. Like I got here on the GO train, but I mean that's not for everybody, right?
Right.
But I last year or 2 years ago we moved from sort of downtown to East York, which is we're about between 10 and 15 kilometers from work.
Yes.
And I bought an electric assist bike.
Okay.
And like just sort of transformed the commute, right?
Cool.
On my regular, analog bike, let's call it. End of the week in the summer, I was kind of tired, right? Doing 20 to 25 kilometers a day.
Yeah.
And that electric assist, like it's fun. You still get exercise, and like it can replace a car. Like we don't have a car.
Wow.
And we can live car free in an area that is not downtown.
Yeah.
And I'm really bullish about the future of electric bikes. And I think the more people ride them, they'll see how fun they are, and then the infrastructure will get there because there'll be more and more demand for it.
Right.
So like, I love cycling in general, but like I think electric assist is going to take off.
And dumb question, but that's like a hybrid. Like you're charging it.
Well, you pedal, and the battery kind of the battery and motor. Motor supports you a little bit.
Okay.
So
and the battery's charged how?
Wall outlet.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, there is a wall outlet.
Yeah.
Okay.
You just plug it in and
wow.
then
So no car, no car payments, no insurance, no fuel.
No.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's a not everybody. It doesn't work for everybody, right? But there's an economic advantage to that too, right? Huge.
Totally. I put 3,000 kilometers on it this past year.
Yeah.
And and then that doesn't account for my other trips on the analog bike, right?
Yeah.
So look, again, it's not for everybody, but I think there's sometimes a hesitation to get into cycling because it's like, bad weather, and I don't want to be sweaty and things like that. And honestly, the electric assist bike, like I know I sound like I'm preaching here, but it's so much fun, and I would encourage anybody.
That's cool.
That's a huge way to lower your carbon footprint.
Yeah.
I mean, and you don't have to do it every day.
No.
But it's something that I think people don't realize how fun it can be. Seriously, to be doing like. I'm keeping up with cars, right? In the bike lanes, and it's like it's really fun.
Oh, that's cool. I'm glad we touched on that. We have a couple guys in our St. Catharines office, and one of them's here today, actually, Pascal, and we've been looking at new office spaces, and he said to me, "Don't make my commute longer," and he bikes in, and he bikes in. I think he's an hour one way, and in Niagara, it's downhill on the way in and it's uphill on the way home. Yeah. And I try to do it more and more as well. I just a conventional road bike, but we when we built our current office, we put a shower in, and we said, people, we want to create that space. So we probably on a good day we have 5 people bike in out of 50, so 10%. But I'm glad we talked about that. That is a really practical, actionable step for people to, even if it's incremental, right? Like even if it's 1 day a week or 2 days a week, that's you're really cutting down on, and you're burning calories, right?
Absolutely.
That's good.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks, David. This has been really, really fun. The stuff we talked about, Transform TO, your green standard, that's City of Toronto website, pretty readily available for people?
Absolutely, yeah. Okay. Transform TO has its own website, webpage. Toronto Green Standard does as well. We have a community energy planning webpage and a district energy one that kind of links to some other things as well.
Cool. Excellent.
So it's all online for sure.
Yeah, right on. Are your coordinates there, or can we link your coordinates in our show notes? And
definitely.
I can.
People? Yeah, absolutely. I have my city email, of course, or my LinkedIn profile. A great way to reach me.
Good. We'll make sure we do that.
Yeah.
Thanks again. This has been. I really appreciate your passion for it and your knowledge of it. You're clearly in it day in and day out, and doing a lot of good work. So, thanks for coming out of the city and spending some time with us. It's been really fun.
Thanks for having me.
Good. Excellent. Well, given the current environment, we'll do that. Awesome. Thanks. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, this was fun.